Today we're going to be talking about, should you do a first look at your wedding?
Should you? Should you not? We're going to dive into it and see what are the advantages of doing a first look, why it makes sense to do it, and why it would make sense not to do it.
I think people think that a first look is going to take away from the big reveal walking down the aisle, and we've seen firsthand that it definitely doesn't. However, I see both sides in the sense that, people want to stay as traditional and have that big moment and have it sort of be like an out of this world experience. But I think first off, we should chat about what is a first look for those who may or may not know what it is.
Yeah, a first look is when you do a first look at each other. It's kind of in the name, but it just means that you'll see each other for the first time, not at the ceremony, but beforehand. And it's a scheduled event that you would put in your timeline that happens roughly a couple hours before. At least that's how we've done it, so that you can get through some of the formal photos before, and then we'll get into it a little bit later, but it lets you enjoy the day, or it gives you a couple different backgrounds to choose from. Anyways, there's lots of advantages of doing the first look, and we're going to dive right into that.
Absolutely. I mean, as wedding photographers and videographers, we see the value in doing a first look from so many perspectives. But I do think that there is room for people to do like the more traditional way if they have a couple of different requirements, if that makes sense. And the main thing that I say about those requirements is that it needs to be based on sort of when, we're looking at losing sunlight. I think if you're getting married in May, we're in North America. And so essentially, it starts to be really bright and like there's lots of sunlight starting May, June, July, August. Once you get into those fall months though, when the days are shorter, then sometimes a first look is really necessary, especially if you're wanting to have a ceremony at 4 p.m. because it just allows you to, again, get a lot of that stuff, not necessarily even the formal photos, but just all of your photos done before it gets dark at say 4 o'clock or 4:30. I feel that a first look is really dependent on a couple of things. So we can dive deeper into why I think that. But really it comes down to the lighting and the timing of when you're thinking about getting married. And then we can kind of work backwards from there. If a first look is really like something you don't want to do, then we need to look at, okay, well, when are you getting married? Are you getting married in May? Then, okay, we have lots of sunlight to work with. We can do all of your photos after the ceremony if you're getting married at 4 or 4:30, and it'll work. But if you're getting married in late October, and you don't want to do a first look, well, maybe you need to move your ceremony up, an hour or two so that there is time in like natural daylight for you to do all of your photos.
And that just depends on the venue as well, because some venues they're not as flexible with their ceremony time, depending on if they have a really rigid system of ceremony dinners at a specific time and they go that way. But what really bugs me about first looks, and if people are deciding to do them, is when they don't really understand the two different sides and they just are automatically laser visioned on either not doing it or doing it, and they don't really understand what it is involved. It's when people say, no, we're not going to do it because that's just traditional, my parents this, I have my own reasons, and they don't understand the time of year makes a big difference, that the locations, the weather as well can play a big part in it. If it's going to rain here in Canada, sometimes it just rains a little bit and then the rain goes away. So having a first look gives you that flexibility of being able to get some nice photos of the two of you outside before a big storm hits or whatever it is. So yeah, let's dive into what we think are some of the advantages of doing a first look.
I want to start off by saying that I have a funny story about a couple that did decide to change their mind. And for whatever reason, it seems to be that men, I don't know why, maybe you can tell me some insight here as to why they really want to stay traditional when it comes to not doing a first look. Almost 9 times out of 10, whenever I ask a couple if they're doing a first look, it's usually because the guy doesn't want to. In this case, this story is that the couple was really set on not doing a first look, even though the bride, I think, preferred or wanted to do one, just because, again, based on timing. They're getting married sort of end of September, wanting to maximize sort of their photo time, et cetera, et cetera. the deciding factor that made them switch, I think even like the week of their wedding to do a first look, was that the groom found that he wouldn't be able to have as much time to eat or like spend time with his friends at cocktail hour once he found out or realized that like what that actually meant is like you're not going to be eating from basically 12 or 1 o'clock until like dinner time at 6 or 7, that he quickly changed his mind and wanted to do a first look.
Food is a good motivator, especially for guys. I think to give a bit of perspective from the guys, the men, and not talking for all men here, but from what I can gather is that we'd rather be forced into something, as in the ceremony, you don't really have a choice. It's going to happen and you're going to see each other for that first time. But if you have the option to opt out of doing something that is romantic or is something that might put you on the spot, then our first reaction is, nah, I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to have to show emotion. I don't want to have to do this. But they don't realize that you'd rather show emotion in a nice intimate setting of the first look than do it in front of your friends and family. Although it does make it a bit different. You're more likely to be a man and macho and not cry, especially if you're surrounded by everyone that knows you at the ceremony site. So maybe there's also that fear of they don't want to get emotional because they're going to be in such a private setting that they might get emotional. So they just back away from that right away. It's instinctual for us.
You think so?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, obviously I'm not a man, so I don't really understand that factor to it. But for him anyways, this deciding factor was really about the food. And because, you know, especially if you have a large family or, you know, we have like a short amount of time to get photos, or you want to do bridal party and then like photos of the two of you in a short amount of time, like there just really isn't time to eat. Like there really isn't time to barely take a sip of water or go to the bathroom, depending on what, you know, the couple wants. So for me, I feel like a first look just allows a little bit more flexibility. Now, I won't lie and say that, you know, it's still pretty busy with photos after the ceremony, even if you do a first look, but it does allow some time for flexibility, especially if you're getting married earlier in the year and we just have a ton of daylight to work with. Like, you could potentially spend, I would say, at least 50% of the cocktail hour with your guests if you had a first look done. You know, we would do some sort of formal family photos after the ceremony for guests that weren't there beforehand. But then you could at least go and have a drink and have some food and hang out with your friends and guests.
Yeah, that's tip number 1. You will actually get to spend time with your friends and family at cocktail hour. That's a big one, because if you don't understand how a timeline works, if you don't do a first look, usually after the ceremony is when you have to do all of the bridal party photos. You have to do all of the formal family photos and some photos of the two of you, like the couple, because you don't have time. Well, you haven't seen each other all day. So sure, you could do all of the different groups like the groom and the groomsmen or bride and bridesmaid, whatever the combinations you have, but you can't do any of the photos that involve both parties, right? And that is a big deal, especially later in the year when you get married at 4, let's say 4:30 is the end of it, and the sun goes away at 6. Really, you only have an hour and a half to complete all of that, which is already not a lot of time. And then 6 hits, you're doing your grand entrance into dinner and to speeches, and really that's the only time you have the whole day to talk to each other as well, right? Not only to hang out with your guests, but to hang out with each other on your wedding day.
It's so true. And I feel people don't realize that the day goes by extremely fast. And even though you're spending, say, like 30 minutes with your guests, it's going to feel like 5. Like it literally will feel like 5 minutes. And it allows for us to, like as photographers and videographers, to do a couple of things. Like for me, I find it's a great time for me to get detail photos if I haven't gotten them already. Like, you know, it's not that I'm not doing anything. It's not like I have a break for half an hour. You know, it allows me to get detail photos or any kind of, you know, maybe you have a sentimental table with pictures or a guest book or whatever. I can go capture all of that if I haven't had a chance to do it yet. It also allows, say, for the video team to go bring their equipment and get set up for the reception and, you know, grand entrance and things like that, moving lights, you know, moving the audio equipment, moving all the tripods. Like there's a lot of sort of stuff that goes into that part of it as well. If you don't do a first look, what I find is that you're gonna feel like it's a photo marathon after the ceremony, especially if you're a couple that doesn't really like to have their photo taken. Imagine doing 2 hours straight of photos that are not even necessarily like super fun, because it's not just the two of you, right? Like it's doing all the photos with your family who, you know, has all their politics and all of their, you know, demands and requests. And then it's doing bridal party, and, you know, maybe people are getting a little bit tipsy or wasted, or they've spilt stuff on themselves, or, you know what I mean? Like there's the benefit of doing it beforehand is that nobody's really eaten, nobody's gotten shit-faced yet, and hopefully you'll just be able to kind of get through things a little bit smoother and easier, and you'll literally be able to have your wedding party and your main family as well be able to fully enjoy the cocktail hour. If you don't do a first look, all of those people are now taken from the cocktail hour to do all of your photos, right? So it's like, not only are you affecting your sort of time, but it's also, you know, your parents' time, your friends' time, etc., right? So there's so many pluses, I think, in doing a first look, that I really think you should be considering it.
Yeah. Yep.
What are some of the other things that you think are reasons to do a first look?
Well, the one that I touched on a little bit earlier is weather. And weather, if it can be sporadic, there's rain coming and going, or if it's cold outside, there's a lot of different ways that you can go out for this opportunity, get some photos, and then come back inside, warm up, and then you kind of break up the times that you would do photos, so it doesn't feel like a marathon. You're not out there for 2 hours straight doing photos with your family, your bridal party. You can do a little bit of pieces, come back, do the ceremony, do a little bit again, and then go enjoy yourself a little bit more. Another advantage of doing it is that when you're waiting to go down the aisle, you don't have to separate everyone into separate rooms because they haven't seen each other. You can kind of just shove everyone in one room and they can kind of mingle and hang out, because your wedding party is probably your group of best friends and you want to spend time with them as well, especially when you're waiting for guests to arrive about half an hour before the ceremony. And that's another kind of bonus, that you get to hang out with your future wife or husband on that day, which is really nice.
One thing that I heard from a wedding planner once is that the bride that she was working with actually felt kind of overwhelmed and almost sick, like passing out, just so nervous, such a wreck, because their ceremony wasn't until 4:30, 5 o'clock. And it had been probably one of the first times she'd really been away from her fiance for that amount of time in such a long time. And on it being such a big day, such a high pressure, high stress day, it wasn't until they finally saw each other that she was actually able to relax. And she said that basically all of her photos up until that point, she just didn't look like herself, because she just kept thinking oh my gosh, I have to get to the aisle and walk down the aisle and do all this. And in the meantime, had she just done a first look, she could have had something where she was just looking forward to seeing, her fiance, versus it being this big production, right? I don't think people realize is that even though you're walking, you're seeing each other, especially if you live together, maybe you can chirp in on this in the terms from a guy's perspective, but when we did our first look, I walked up to you, you looked at me, you're cool, you look great. I just had more makeup on that day, my hair was done different, and I had a nicer dress. It wasn't I don't know, you can maybe chime in and let me know if it was any different, but it was just oh, you look so nice, yay. It wasn't this crazy moment for us, because we also had a 2-year-old running around. But when I walked down the aisle, though, I lost it. I was so emotional, them putting the veil in my hair and attaching the second piece of my dress and holding my dad and walking down the aisle. That was really a lot for me. It really hit me as oh my gosh, it's happening. That part was so emotional for me. And I feel people think that because you do a first look that it's going to take away from that. I feel it's actually the opposite. It actually just helps you calm down and look forward to seeing each other and be efficient on your day. And then when you do walk down the aisle, that's when it really kicks you oh my gosh, I'm getting married and everybody's watching me and looking at me, right?
Yeah, I think it maybe takes away from you guys seeing each other for the first time, but it also, when you close that door, it opens up the door that you get to really experience everyone else that's there. And you're not just kind of laser focused on the one person that you're oh, we finally got to see each other, but you also just kind of take it in. You take in the venue, the people that are all there. You see all their faces, their reaction, everyone being so happy for you. And I think that has something of value, right? Mm-hmm. And you said it yourself already, that it takes away the nerves sometimes of a bride, being a wreck because all day long up until 4 o'clock, she couldn't see him. And so having that first look takes a little bit of that away and segues nicely into, if you're not doing personal vows at the aisle or at the ceremony, then you can also do a reading to each other at the first look, which is a more intimate moment. You can say, some things that maybe you didn't want to say in front of your family. So that's another big advantage of doing a first look, is that you get to say some nice words to each other. And as a videographer, it's always really nice to at least have some personal vows, a little card or just a little something that can really elevate not only your video, but also just the experience of the wedding day altogether.
One last point that I wanted to touch on when it comes to first look is that you get more opportunity to do photos. Like, you can do it up until the ceremony or as close to the ceremony happening as possible. For instance, when I'm shooting a couple who can't see each other, it's not really possible for them to be anywhere close to each other, especially say like 30 minutes, 45 minutes before the ceremony. But they may need to be on location at that point because, they want to make sure that everything is ready to go, that everybody is there, family is there, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a good point. The venue may not allow that flexibility of doing photos at the same time for two different groups of people without seeing each other.
Well, just depending on the location, it just might not be possible just based on the size of the venue. Like, because you're also having to think about guests that are coming as well that you don't want to see. For example, one of the venues that we do shoot at a lot, they have an area where it's kind of off to the side, off a cliff essentially, where it's private. And so at that venue in particularly, I can do family photos almost right up until the ceremony happens. Usually like 15, 20 minutes up until the ceremony happens, I'm still capturing, a picture of you with your mom or you with your dad. I can do that. Or maybe it's you with the bridal party. Like, I have an opportunity to do that because they're both there on site. The ceremony's happening, guests are arriving, and it's not like this wasted time, if that makes sense, because that hour before the ceremony is like, we kind of need to make sure we got everything done that we needed to get done in the morning, but we also need to make sure that we're maximizing that time. And what I found is that depending on the venue or, if they can't see each other, we're just not able to do that because that hour is almost like a waste, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it really isn't conducive to if any of the events start running late as well before the ceremony. And even after the ceremony, because if you're banking on having enough time between dinner and the ceremony to get all of your photos done, the guests are starting to arrive late, the ceremony starts late for whatever reason, that really eats up into that time that you'll have. And especially if you don't have enough daylight, that you can't really push back dinner. It doesn't really make any sense. And you're just fighting the clock at that point, which makes it more stress for us as the vendors, more stress for the couple. And nobody likes to rush through photos. You'll be able to see it in your faces, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good point. And how many times have we been to a wedding where they've been 15 minutes late to start? And it's not any fault to anyone, but sometimes it's like a shuttle bus is late, or we've had it where an important person like a dad, is just not there yet. And had we done family photos before, if we had done them, say the ceremony's at 4, and we did those formal family photos of you and your immediate family at say 3 o'clock, well, we already know that all the important people are there. We don't have to wait for them. If we missed second cousin who showed up 10 minutes late to your ceremony, we're not holding the wedding for them, We're holding the wedding if your dad's not there. A first look just helps, especially if you have a family who's just known to be late to everything. We actually put little tips in our timelines when we meet with couples to say, okay, is your family just notoriously late for things, especially like on a day that's very, very important, just because there's so many logistics. It's a new place. They have to do hair and makeup or, steam suits or dresses, like all of those things that can kind of really accentuate essentially people being late to things. By having them show up, say, for 2:30 to do family photos, even though we really don't start them until 3, it just allows for that wiggle room. And it does work really, really well. And we say, show up at this time, at this location. Usually we haven't run into any issues when we do stuff like that. So
we didn't talk about any disadvantages of doing first look. And I think I know the reason why, because there just isn't any.
If you wanted to do the traditional thing, walk down the aisle, all of those things, it's not that it can't happen. I mean, we do it all the time. I would say it's less and less than it used to be. And I straight up asked couples, like, would you do it the same way again? Like, would you have done, like, not do a first look? And all of them said, yeah, like, we're so glad we didn't do one. Like, it's not that it doesn't happen. It's just that you have to think about the timing. Now, to keep in mind, these two weddings that I'm thinking about in particular, one was in June and one was in July. And so they had a lot of time, like nothing was missed. So it's not that it's not impossible, but you do have to think about all of those logistics. And if you really don't want a first look, then you're going to have to get married earlier. You know, that's just what it is. Or you're going to have to get married earlier in the year, or you're going to do photos inside with flashes, right? Because you're just not going to be able to do it. So there's a lot of things to think about. It's not because we want you to do it and that's the only way we're going to do things. It's just that we know that couples who do it just have a much better day, right?
Oh, I want them to do it. I'll advocate for that. And again, it's obviously their choice and what they want to do. But I think there's so many advantages to doing it. So ladies, if you're trying to convince your man to do it, just talk about the food, talk about hanging out with your friends, talk about hanging out with each other. That usually gets them on board. In the end, if you decide not to do one, just be prepared to plan around it. Use the tips and tricks that we talked about, how earlier in the year, you know, midsummer is probably one of the best times to do it. Just get married earlier, you know, like a 1, 2 o'clock ceremony, whatever it is. Which just means that your hair and makeup's gonna have to start earlier, you know, and that it just domino effects backwards.
It just affects the bride, basically.
Exactly.
Affects the women.
The guy can still get up and probably play a round of golf.
That's why it's just not fair, right? If the guy's making that decision, it is totally not fair to the girls to have to get up at the crack of dawn because they don't want to do a first look. So, yeah.
You know what I have to say to that? That sucks.
Dangle the carrot of the food and also being able to hang out with people.
Well, carrot is a food, so you know, it's just dangle the carrot.
I know, but the carrot isn't gonna, you know, you gotta dangle the
beer and pizza.
The beer and, you know, what else is there that they get? The canapé, the little sliders.
Sliders, ooh, yeah.
You know, or the lamb chops.
How do we think of the same thing? In the end, first looks, no first look. It's your decision, but you have to make sure that you do your research. You have to make sure that you understand the consequences of each one and be prepared. Talk to your vendors about what it is that they think might be the best fit for you and be ready to listen.
Or be ready to be disappointed. See you next time.